Thank you, Gary, for that lovely introduction, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight on this blustery, cold, not so spring-like evening. I have no candies and I have no cows with me, but I do have what I think are some interesting stories about the way in which Secord becomes this heroine of English Canada in the War of 1812. First of all, can everybody hear me? I just want to make sure that everything is working as it should. Great, thank you. So yes, there must be something in the chocolate. And I will refer to the chocolates and to the candy company later on, but if you want to just have a look at those different representations of Secord over time that the candy company itself realized had changed. Some of you may well be familiar with the two later ones. The first one is a somewhat older one from the 1920s and the 1930s. So my talk is going to take a different perspective on the War of 1812 by looking at one of its most enduring and powerful legacies, its memory. I think that's particularly today, of course, but I think over the course of the 19th and into the 20th century, that's one of the most powerful ways of thinking about the war. And there are different ways that memory could be approached, but today I'm going to focus on the different kinds of narratives that were told about Laura Secord, starting in the 19th century and working my way up to the present day. And this research comes out of my book that Gary mentioned, which is co-authored with Dr. Colin Coates of York University. It's a comparative study of Laura Secord and Madeleine de Verchères, the heroine of New France. And in it we look at the role that historical memory and commemoration played in the shaping of both English and French Canadian nationalism. Well, why Secord? The very easy answer is that I started my career as a historian studying Upper Canada, and I was particularly interested in gender and women's roles and women's experiences in the colony. But there are other reasons why I thought it would be important to look at her story. First, for many years, she was the only English-Canadian woman who appeared in historical narratives of Canada, particularly in textbooks for public and high school students, but of course not exclusively. And when we look at the kinds of symbols that Western nations have used to personify the nation, to help shape national identity, women tend to appear only as allegorical or symbolic figures. In other words, you rarely see an actual historical woman, someone we know existed, whose flesh and blood being used as a symbol of the nation. So Secord was, in many ways, an anomaly, and I wanted to find out why she managed to make it into the history books and into people's public historical consciousness when so many other women didn't, and other women who we know, who were brave and heroic during the War of 1812, or in the Loyalist Exodus, or in other kinds of events and processes in Canadian history. And I was also interested in examining the role that Canadian history had played. What was its social role? What kind of role did historical knowledge play in 19th and 20th century Canada? So in other words, why were people concerned with the past? Why did it matter to them? What uses did they make of it? And how and why did their narratives change over time? And I also was interested in finding out where people received their information about history. Where did they get these kinds of narratives? Where did they come from? Was their knowledge of the past only from textbooks and the teachers, or had other locations been important? And certainly I would argue, as a history professor, that textbooks and teachers have been important in the past, and they've been significant. But as I found out in researching the Secord story, they certainly weren't the only places, and they weren't the only genres. So, for example, objects, such as historical monuments, places such as historical museums, historical exhibitions, and even landscapes. And in Secord's case, of course, the landscape of the Niagara area, particularly Queenston, also have been read for certain lessons about the past. And, of course, there's the candy company and its advertising. What did it tell Canadians about Laura Secord in the War of 1812? I was really quite interested in trying to dig into that. So although my talk is not going to be about the walk itself tonight, I will go over that briefly, just in case anybody needs a refresher, in case those high school or elementary history lessons are a little bit further behind than maybe you might think. She was born in 1775 in Barrington, Massachusetts, and her family emigrated to Upper Canada in 1795. So they weren't part of that initial Loyalist emigration of refugees immediately after the American Revolution. But she did marry James Secord, who was a descendant of a Loyalist family. Around 1797, we're not entirely sure of their wedding date, and they settled in Queenston. Now, during the War of 1812, James Secord fought in the Upper Canadian Militia, and he was wounded at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October of 1812. And it seems that James never really fully recovered from his injuries. They left him, some call him a semi-invalid, but certainly somewhat disabled for the rest of his life. So in June 1813, American troops occupied the Niagara Peninsula, and the Secords overheard of a surprise attack to be launched on the British Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon at Beaver Dams, which is approximately 18 to 20 miles west. And it's not clear from the stories, either from Secord's own accounts or from the narratives that were told later in the 19th century, just who heard the news first. Was it James? Was it Laura? Was it their servants? We're not entirely sure. And it's not entirely clear either how the decision was made that Laura should try to pass the news of this impending sabotage on. In some versions of the story, James is the one who overhears, but he can't go because of his wounds. It's physically impossible for him to walk that far on his own. So it's decided that Laura will go. In other stories, Laura overhears the Americans discussing this attack. But in both cases, it's said she's the one who insists on going. And it does appear that she did not go alone. She, for at least part of the journey, took one of her nieces. But on the morning of June the 22nd, she set out to warn James Fitzgibbon, tramping on foot through the Niagara bush on a path until she reached Beaver Dams, where she met Indigenous allies, convinced them that she needed to see him, and delivered her news to them. So that's kind of the story in a kernel or a nugget. Fitzgibbon was thus able to outwit the Americans using his Kahnawake Mohawk allies and win the Battle of Beaver Dams. And some have argued that that was a very strategically important battle in keeping the Niagara Peninsula sort of safe at that point. Now, I think it's important to know that Secord's commemoration as a heroine didn't happen overnight. From 1820 on, she and James submitted a number of petitions to the Upper Canadian authorities asking for patronage appointments or for a pension. These petitions mentioned her service to the Crown, but they weren't written with commemoration in mind. I mean, she wasn't trying to turn herself into a heroine. Basically, the Secords were finding it difficult to support their family since James was disabled and they needed a position of some kind. He couldn't make a living, it seems, from farming full-time, and they had children to take care of, and particularly a number of daughters who needed to be looked after. At one point, for example, she was offered the job of caretaker of Isaac Brock's monument in Queenston, but she lost the position when a new lieutenant governor arrived in Upper Canada and favoured another candidate, a militia captain's widow, Teresa Nichols. And the first published account of Secord's walk appeared in the Anglican paper The Church in 1845. It was written by her son, who wanted to offer his support for Fitzgibbon. Fitzgibbon's eligibility for a grant for his military service was being questioned in the legislature. So this account of Secord's walk was published. But during the mid-19th century, you start to see more and more accounts of Laura Secord. Her narrative started to appear in a number of histories of the War of 1812. It showed up in American author Benson Lossing's account of the war, and then in an Upper Canadian book written by William Coffin. And it's Coffin who added the cow that she supposedly milked to get around to the U.S. century. And while we're pretty sure that this cow really, never was, I think there are a number of reasons why Coffin chose it. For one, it provided a kind of a logical, plausible explanation that Secord could have offered to the Americans. I'm out here to look after my cow. But I think it also did help start establishing her as an icon of pioneer domesticity. Here's a good pioneer housewife looking after the cow. Now, by 1860, she did achieve some success in public recognition for her walk and her contribution to Upper Canada's cause. She managed to obtain £100 from the Prince of Wales, who was touring Canada at the time, or British North America rather, and this event was covered in the Niagara Press, so there was some discussion of Laura Secord's bravery and her contribution to upper Canadian loyalty. But she died in 1868, so she didn't have very long to enjoy that £100, and she died before her name started to appear in more and more commemorative texts and genres. Now, I would date the first really large-scale phase of her commemoration in the late 1880s. A school teacher from the Niagara area named R.A. Land decided that Laura Secord deserved a monument. One should be put up in her honor, and he proposed a fundraising campaign that he believed should be supported primarily by women and children. He felt that they were the most appropriate people to put money towards memorializing Laura Secord. And Land was joined in these efforts by a number of middle-class English-Canadian women, such as the British-born journalist, temperance supporter, and suffrage advocate Sarah Curzon. Curzon was a founding member of the Women's Historical Society of Toronto in 1885, and as well by Emma Curry, who was a St. Catharines resident, and Curry too supported suffrage and temperance. And she would go on to found the St. Catharines Women's Literary Club in 1892. Now, both Curzon and Curry wrote accounts of Secord's walk. Curzon wrote it in dramatic form in a play, and Curry wrote historical prose. And they and their contemporaries in the women's groups and in the newly founded Ontario Historical Society worked to get funds for first a monument to Secord that was put up in 1901 at Lundy's Lane. Let's see, yep, there we go. And it's a little, I realize it's a little murky, but there are carnations. When I took that photo in October of 2000, there'd just been a commemorative service for the Battle of Queenston Heights, and someone had placed carnations the day before at the foot of the Secord Monument, which I thought was somewhat interesting and evidence of interest in her story and in her contribution. So you have this monument. They also managed to commission a portrait of Laura Secord in 1905 that was hung in the Ontario Legislature. It was painted, of course, from memory. One of her descendants, one of her grandchildren, advised the painter as to what it should look like. And in 1910, a second monument was put up at Queenston Heights. So by the time you get to the other kind of commemorative services that were held in 1912 for the war, and by the outbreak of World War I, there were both public commemorative edifices and a number of written tributes that claimed Secord as a true Canadian heroine, not only by Curzon and Curry, but other papers that were written by the various historical organizations that were being founded in Southern Ontario during this period. And I think it's interesting to compare these kinds of stories to the petitions that Secord and her family members wrote. Now, it's true that the basic elements of the story didn't deviate. The fundamentals remained the same. She was, said to have, done the walk, got to Fitzgibbon in time, informed him of the impending American attack, and thereby keeping Upper Canada safe. But she wasn't, unlike, say, Madeleine de Verchères or the even more famous Joan of Arc, portrayed as taking up arms against her country. No one suggested that she had engaged in any kind of military endeavors. But what you do see changing are some of the details, the rhetorical strategies and the devices that shaped these stories, the elaborations that were made, and I think the meanings that were meant to be drawn from these embellishments. I mentioned the cow. Here is a textbook illustration. So here you have the cow, Laura Secord, looking decidedly genteel and rather well-dressed for a woman who's going out to milk her cow, living on the frontier of Upper Canada, and the American sentry looking rather stern and annoyed about her. But these are the kinds of things that you see in the books. And I think the ways in which these stories were told, they were shaped by the context of late 19th and early 20th century English-Canadian imperialism. These were people who were very supportive of Canada's tie to the British Empire, but they were also Canadian nationalists as well. They believed that Canada had a very special role to play in the empire. And as I mentioned, in terms of people like Curzon and Curry, many of them were also supporters of women's rights. For a lot of these historians, the history of Canada could be found in the history of Ontario. Ontario was the place where all the important events had happened. And for a number of them, it was the Niagara area, even more so, where Canada as a nation could really have been said to have been born. And I think it's no accident that much of the work that was conducted to commemorate Secord was conducted in Ontario. And I pointed out the initial campaign to memorialize her was shaped by the assumption that women and children would be the best people that should be out in the forefront of these attempts. And I think one of the most striking aspects of her transformation into this heroine was the theme of her femininity, her domesticity, her role as a wife and mother, and thus her respectability. And her commemorators did this in a number of ways. They provided many details of her appearance. They talked about her physical fragility. And Fitzgibbon had indeed described her as a small and slight woman, but they said her physical fragility masked a sturdiness of character and bravery. And then they would also go on to provide very detailed descriptions of the clothing that she wore on her walk, which we really have no idea what she, precisely what she was wearing. And then they would go on to talk about the kinds of clothes that she liked to wear as a young girl. Again, somewhat invented. But they also emphasized her identity as a wife and mother. This is, I think, very crucial to her story. For example, some of the narratives, when they talk about Secord's decision to go, they move her back in time to the Battle of Queenston Heights to get to, and she reflects upon that particular event. And they tell the story of how she found James on the battlefield, badly wounded, and how she'd had to interpose her body between James and the common, they're always common in this story, common American soldiers who were getting ready to kill him. Now, in these stories, the couple is rescued by an American officer who recognizes the rules of fair play in wartime. And in one, I think, particularly memorable story, this particular American officer is said to have been a former beau of Laura Secord's, who then, after they have got James safely off the battlefield, says to her, "Don't you regret your decision to give up on me and to give up on the New Republic?" And she says, no, my heart is with James, my heart is with Upper Canada, it's with Britain, and therefore with Canada. So these are the kinds of things that get added, the elements that get added to the story. But the point is that acting as a loyal and dutiful wife was something that wasn't unknown to Laura Secord. The stories also talk about the fact that she had to take into account the fate of her 5 children when she was making her decision to go. And I think here you can see that the commemorators wanted to emphasize that Secord's story was proof of Canadian women's historical activism and agency. So despite being wives and despite being mothers and having all the responsibilities that went along with those roles, they could still be members of the nation and contribute to its well-being. And that included, again, for some of her commemorators, having the vote. That would not undermine their femininity at all. And an important aspect of the attacks on women having the vote in this period was the fact that it would make them masculine and that they would move away from their responsibilities as wives and mothers. So there was nothing unnatural, in other words, that Laura Secord's story shows. There's nothing unnatural about women acting in both capacities, moving across the realms of both private and public. And of course, the corollary of this was that women could act in a public spirit. They were capable of undertaking acts of physical courage and realizing when their wifely and maternal duties had to be put aside to serve their country. But I think because of this malleability, because of this respectability, Secord then is a very malleable figure. She could and did appeal to those who were supporters of suffrage, but she also appealed to those who were not necessarily all that much in favor of women having the vote, or who in some cases were probably opposed to it. Instead, for them, she became a symbol of the power of loyalty to the country and to the crown. This was a loyalty that could touch and transform even wives and mothers and sort of harness their energies for the nation. And also because she returned home once her duty was done, and she didn't ask for any reward on her own behalf. If you remember, the petitions were all aimed at getting support for her family, not for herself. She could symbolize both maternal and national self-sacrifice and bring the two together without creating any fear of a transgression of appropriate feminine roles. Her respectability was reinforced, too, as I've mentioned, by the fact that she didn't take up arms. There's, again, no suggestion that she acts in any kind of military capacity. So the story was told in ways that managed and suppressed any suggestion of disorderly conduct on her part, which I think is quite interesting. Now, another part of this commemoration that I think is also critically important was her relationship to Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous men, and her meeting with the Kahnawake Mohawk before she reached Fitzgibbon. And here's another illustration from, this is a little later, but I've chosen this one because it reproduces a bit better than some of the older ones. Here she is, and the caption underneath in the book says, "She walked calmly up to them." So here she is meeting them. And I think it's very interesting, although I think that is supposed to be the moon behind her. It looks like a halo. It very much looks like a halo. She's dressed almost in, sort of classical, almost Grecian kind of garb, looking very, very almost allegorical. But I think here, in all these discussions of her relationship to these warriors, it's where the racial dimension of Secord as a white woman becomes clearest. Now, she didn't mention her meeting with the Mohawk in her earliest petition of 1820, and she only briefly touched upon it in 1840. By 1853, though, she did choose to elaborate on her encounter with them. She mentioned that she'd met them, that she felt great fear, but she overcame it. But as you move into the early 20th century and the story is retold, this encounter gets elaborated on even more so, and her fears get added to it. And the fear, I believe, was not, that they're trying to allude to, was not overtly sexual. And I think there's a great part of the story to be thought about in terms of her fear of sexual assault out there on the path to Beaver dams. But rather the way they talk about her fears, they suggest that it's physical violence. It's a fear of being tomahawked, being scalped, that she's most afraid of. She's said in the stories to have been fearful of wild animals, which is quite logical given where she was, American soldiers, also quite logical, but also roving bands of Indigenous warriors. This gets stressed in a number of the accounts, who might have been allied with either the Americans or the British. Now, using Indigenous people in this way, particularly men, wasn't unique to Secord's story. There were precedents for it. There were captivity narratives, for example, that had circulated in the northeastern colonies and then in the United States since the 17th century. And in these narratives, Europeans, particularly women, were taken captive by Indigenous people in the context of war or frontier violence. These captivity narratives were ubiquitous and very long-standing in the United States, and often depicted the encounter between these two groups as being one of great violence or fear of violence. And while we have fewer of these tales in Canada, we don't have the whole kind of genre of captivity narratives in Canada, there were some that were circulated in English Canada in the wake of the Riel Uprising of 1885. They were written by two white women who supposedly had been taken captive by Big Bear and Métis people. It looks more as though they were actually trying to protect them. But these women and their stories had returned to Ontario just as Secord's Commemoration was becoming more and more popular. So I think there were other narratives which might have reinforced this phenomenon in the Secord stories. Now, Laura Secord's narrative found its way into many history textbooks and readers for Canadian children from the 1880s on. And so some of the illustrations that I'm showing you tonight are just a small sample of the ones that I've seen in these books. There were other women who show up from time to time. Jean Mance in New France, Madeleine de Verchères, Anna Jameson, the British writer who had toured Upper Canada in the 1830s and who had written about her impressions of the colony, Susanna Moodie, or Catherine Parr Traill. But it was Secord's name that appeared in both these texts and those that mention no other woman at all. So if there's any woman in these books, it's Laura Secord. And I should point out that the significance of this is that these textbooks, like the historical societies, highlighted the War of 1812 as a defining moment in the birth of Canada. They talked about 1812 as being this, in the way that people often talk about World War I, as being this time when French and English Canada came together to unite against a common foe, and sometimes Indigenous people get put into the mix as well. Some of these narratives, particularly those that were used in high schools, offer few details about her. They just state the bare facts of the walk, but the ones for younger children, particularly the readers, elaborated on them. And it's true that not all of them presented the Mohawk as embodiments of a kind of a threatening other. In some illustrations, they're completely absent. You really hear very little about them, or you don't see them. And in others, they might even appear as dignified and figures of diplomacy. And there's some element, I think, of that in this one. But in others, they were indeed drawn as brutal, threatening, and vicious figures who were a direct danger to her. And here's one. And I realize that, from your perspective, you probably see Laura Secord most clearly. There's an Indigenous man in the bottom corner, and there's one up at the top who's holding a rifle against her. But what you see is this white woman being threatened by these Indigenous warriors. And these illustrations and the accompanying text would highlight her whiteness and femininity even further. They contrast, as this one does, her blonde hair and her fair skin and the complete covering of her body, often in a white dress. How white it would have been by that point in the journey, I don't very much doubt, but anyway. And they contrast all of this, though, with native men's dark, muscular physiques, their lack of upper body covering, so they would be depicted as wearing loincloths and moccasins, and the ornamentation of their hair and bodies, scalp locks, piercings, sometimes tattoos. And this casting of the Mohawk as the potential villains in this historical drama continued to grow into the late 20s and 1930s. Now, in 1930, the Secords story came under attack by William Stewart Wallace, who was a University of Toronto librarian and historian. And Wallace wrote a pamphlet in which he admitted that, indeed, she had performed her famous walk. He was never disputing the fact that the walk had been undertaken. He described her story, and here I'm quoting Wallace, as having a romantic quality, such as endears it to even the hard heart of the professional historian, and that it is typical of the heroism of the mothers and daughters of the Upper Canadian pioneers. And there's a tinge of patronizing language, I think, here. He admitted that her description of her encounter with the Indians, as he put it, has about it a strong air of verisimilitude, and he found that her courage and patriotism were undoubted. But he argued that her historical significance was in fact highly overrated, since, again Wallace, the story she told from memory in later years, and no doubt sincerely believed, was seriously at variance with the facts, and that she played no part in determining the issue of the Battle of Beaver Dams. According to Wallace, Fitzgibbon already knew of the impending attack from the Kahnawake Scouts. Now, I think what was at issue here was not just Secord herself. I think Wallace made a very strategic decision to use Secord as an example of the way in which we have to think about the nature of historical truth and historical methodology, and I think that's what underpinned his attack on Laura Secord. He based his arguments on military and legal sources, in which he argued reality was to be found. And he objected to both Secord's and Fitzgibbon's stories because they were based on memory. As Wallace described it, a notoriously and treacherous and fallacious medium for the transmission of historical truth. And a story told 25 years after the event is not likely to be as reliable as a story told at the time, especially when it lacks contemporary corroboration. But he also attacked Secord's own account, even though it did make its first appearance in 1820, so not that long after the event, because it had a financial object, getting a patronage position. And he pointed out in support of his case that she was unsuccessful, thereby deducing that the Upper Canadian government probably didn't believe her either. I think what's interesting, though, about Wallace's piece is that he didn't subject the American military accounts to the same scrutiny. He didn't look at their narratives' possible motives. Instead, he used Secord and her account as a way to inveigh against unreliable memory, which he in many ways feminized in his discussion. And I think it's also critical to realize that Wallace himself was part of a move to establish historical research, particularly that in Canadian history in the universities. He's part of the professionalization of the craft. So he wanted to set himself and his colleagues up as professionals, ones who didn't rely on romantic tales based on what he saw as unsubstantial and unverifiable reminiscences that were being used by the historical societies. Now, today we might call those reminiscences oral histories and think of them in a different kind of way. But that was not the way in which the historical profession in Canada was developing at that moment. But even Wallace used sources that had been produced well after 1813, military records and reports that had been generated by US military officers who were eager to exonerate themselves or to gain something. They weren't really the disinterested and completely objective materials that he felt they were. Now, Wallace's attack was met with great indignation by Secord supporters. A long piece appeared in Saturday Night, for example, the magazine, citing an 1820 certificate that delineated more precisely than any other documents the importance of the walk, and other defenses, particularly from the Niagara area, appeared in print. Some textbook writers simply ignored Wallace and continued on with the way that they always treated Laura Secord. Others modified their accounts, though, by claiming that she was a very brave woman who performed a great deed and thus was an inspiration to children, particularly girls, but that Fitzgibbon had already received the news, and others simply ignored her and omitted her story. And the text of the post-World War II period changed as well, and so the time that was being spent on the War of 1812 was cut back. So what you see happening from, say, the 1950s and 1960s is that Laura Secord in some of these texts, particularly at the high school level, was replaced by the pioneer woman of Upper Canada as a more sort of fitting example. Well, finally, how did the Candy Company deploy Secord's image? I showed you the shifts of time in that cameo earlier. And I think it's kind of ironic that her status as a historical figure, or at least her presence in many people's consciousness, has much to do with the use of her name to head a major candy company. When I first would tell people that I was working on this research in late 1990s, they would recognize her through the candy company and sometimes conflate Laura Secord, the candy company in the War of 1812, and think that she made candies for the Americans or something like that. I did have a couple of people say that. I'm never quite sure if they were saying it in jest or not. Although it's kind of ironic because for a historian, the candy company's records are actually some of the most fragmented and incomplete of all the areas I examined in trying to look at this story. But there is something that can be said about it. The Laura Secord Company was founded by Frank O'Connor in 1913, so at the height of the commemorations of the War of 1812 in Secord. Frank O'Connor would go on to become a senator. And according to the company's narratives, O'Connor chose the name Laura Secord out of a desire to identify his products with wholesomeness, purity, domesticity, and cleanliness. That's according to the story the candy company tells me anyway. So O'Connor opened his first set of stores in Toronto and Montreal. They were quite successful, and that prompted him to expand across these provinces, across Ontario and Quebec, and then into Winnipeg in the 1930s. Now, the company has changed hands many times from the 1960s on, and I'm not even going to begin to try and trace the genealogy of the Secord Candy Company. Suffice it to say that at one point it was owned by an American company that Frank O'Connor originally founded, so there's a bit of another historical irony there. But I think what's interesting is when you look at the company's advertising in the 19-teens and the 20s, they didn't choose to make Secord's historical significance the centerpiece of its advertising. Very few of the ads refer to her walk. In fact, I don't think I've seen any that actually talk about the walk itself or talk about Secord so much as a heroine. You don't see her walking to the nearest candy store as some kind of act of patriotic consumerism. But they did use a portrait, and I hope this one is somewhat legible. The candy company's ads are a little hard to reproduce, I'm afraid. But they did use a portrait modeled after the one that was hung in the legislature. And it's a beribboned cameo of an elderly woman wearing a white bonnet tied with a large white bow. And that border around the ad consists of maple leaves. And they use that constantly in their advertising in the 20s and 30s and into the 40s. And of course, the maple leaves, suggest pride and dedication to Canada by this point. And I think probably in the context of the interwar decades, there wouldn't have been really any need to remind potential consumers who Laura Secord was. I think she was present enough in people's historical consciousness that that would have been understood. Instead, what the company chose to do was to create its own history. And so there's something they stress over and over again in the ads. They talk about their history of dedication to purity of materials and to the care and preparation that went into the making of the candies, to the importance of the candy maker's craft, and to a determination to give Canadians, who were their customers, the very best possible quality that they could. And this is very typical of the candy company's approach. And I think many of the company's strategies, not least its use of a historical figure that was herself a figure of loyalty, evoked continuity, stability, and tradition in the face of a changing and possibly confusing world in the 1920s and particularly in the 1930s. I think there's something there in their choice. And the man and woman who bought Secord products would thus be assured of the very best of Canadian goods and craftsmanship. So they sort of intertwine dedication to the brand and dedication to the nation over and over again in their ads. There are other themes that connected the company implicitly to her image through its ads. They like to point out to the plainness and simplicity, both tied to purity and to domesticity, with which their goods were purveyed. When they talked about the fact that their shop's interiors and the exteriors were white. So too were the candy boxes, and with gold trim around the Secord Cameo and black lettering. So very, very simple, very plain. At one point in the 1930s, the company issued directions to its store managers to be careful about the personal appearance of the women who sold the confectionery in the stores. Preferably, the managers were told they should be blonde, and blue-eyed, and white. And this is, I've seen this in one of the private directives. And the company's delivery trucks, which had the trademark Laura Secord black signature, were painted on their sides, were also white. See that one? Yeah. That's, I think from the 1930s that some of the dates are not. It's not possible to establish them completely. And their ads also emphasized that those responsible for Laura Secord candies were artisans who deployed their carefully executed and perfectly timed craft in studios. They were not workers who labored in factories on assembly lines and who could produce vast quantities on demand. And every so often they'd run an ad saying, our dear friends, and they always address their potential consumers as friends, not as buyers or consumers. Our dear friends, we're very sorry that we have run out. You have to understand that we can't just churn out vast quantities of this confectionery as the market demands. You have to wait for it, and it's worth waiting for it. So there's this kind of emphasis on the artisanal value of Laura Secord candy. Now, after World War II, the company did decide to make some changes to its image, and that started with the design of the candy box. It now featured, in their words, young and beautiful Laura Secord in a miniature style painting in full color, rather than the old portrait with the embossed gold frame, which had a slightly funereal appearance. And I don't know if you remember the middle cameo featured this younger sort of woman in her teens, early 20s. But despite this vaunted leap forward into modern times, the company didn't completely jettison its link to historical time. The cameo wasn't a picture of a 1950s woman, it was rather an early 19th century maiden, albeit one presented in ways that might appeal to a 1950s sensibility. Her white dress was much more revealing than the bonnet, large bow, and black frock of the older Secord, and her head was bare, with center-parted hair in a wavy but demure arrangement, and her gaze is directed at the spectator. They also experimented with other forms of promotion that mixed past and present, tradition and modernity, such as booths at the CNE. Oh, sorry, those are the workers in their artisanal setting. And I think that they're putting together Easter baskets or Mother's Day arrangements, but that's circa 1950s, mid-50s. Note the beehive and the lawns. But here we have Laura Secord, CNE. And this is a display that the company sponsored. We have Elsie the Borden cow, the milkmaid, who might have been a dairy queen, or a dairy princess, I'm not entirely sure, and Laura Secord's milking stool, which was borrowed from the Niagara Historical Society in August of 1954. So you have the booth at the CNE. They also sponsored a Highlanders band in the 1954 Grey Cup Parade. And here we have the drum majorette. And when I asked for more details about this particular display, the people at the Secord Candy Company said, we decided we would not do that again. I'm not quite sure why, but they decided that that was not in keeping with the kind of image of Laura Secord that they wanted to present. But they didn't entirely abandon their appeal to the past. And this is, I'm afraid this one is a little fuzzier, but the caption there says, there's a sentimental reason to give Laura Secord candies to your mother. She probably gave them to hers. And so here you have in the center a late Victorian Edwardian woman. On your left, you have a woman who's probably meant to be from the 1940s, given the flip of the hair. And here you have a young modern mother of the 1960s. But here you have some of the candy company tying together both tradition and maternity and domesticity again. And it's kind of a, keeping the company in both modern times and using tradition. So as well as these kinds of ads, the company also bought and renovated the Secord House in Queenston. And for the sake of time, I think I'll leave that story out for now, because it's rather a long and complicated one. But suffice it to say, it was in private hands. There were numerous attempts made. People badgered the Niagara Parks Commission and then the provincial government and the Ontario Heritage Foundation to have it taken over because it was falling apart. Finally, in 1968, the Secord Company bought it, renovated it with, in terms of their publicity, with a strong emphasis on authenticity, but also set up a candy store outside as well. It's now owned by the Niagara Parks Commission, and I think the candy store is still there. But there's another dimension, just before I leave the Secord Company, that I'd like, of their advertising, that I'd like to draw your attention to. And nowhere in their ads did they mention the role of Indigenous people in the Secords Company. From being either threatening warriors or loyal allies, the Mohawks simply vanish from the narratives that were told through the ads. So apparently they didn't have any role to play as purveying candies to the Canadian nation. So in conclusion, how is her story being told today? Well, in 1999, an internet poll named Secord as one of the top 10 memorable Canadians, along with Terry Fox, Louis Riel, Tommy Douglas, Nellie McClung, and Isaac Brock. The story's still being told in books for girls. It's still being told in schools. Every so often I receive email requests from children who are working on Laura Secord for their Heritage Fair projects. In 1996, the folk group Tanglefoot recorded a lovely version of a song called Secord's Warning, which emphasizes her bravery over everything else. She's also been recognized by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board as a person of national significance, and there's a plaque that testifies to this at the Queenston Monument. There are more, I would say, less reverent versions of the Secord story. Very recently, This Hour Has 22 Minutes, dressed up Sean Majumder and had him running through the woods. I think he was fighting off squirrels or something like that, as Laura Secord. And this was in the context of poking fun at the federal government's commemoration of 1812. This particular one, which I think is actually one of my favorite ones, I live in Niagara-on-the-Lake, is a poster from the Angel Inn in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And the caption at the bottom says, here you have, Secord as this kind of saucy barmaid. The real reason I followed the circuitous, difficult, and perilous route was in order to protect Upper Canada and ensure that you could have the Angel Inn's best bidder. So there you go. Now, on a more serious note, in Niagara, a group of people will be reenacting Laura Secord's walk on June 22nd of this year. The walk is being organized by a direct descendant of Laura Secord, Carolyn McCormick, and if you're interested, you can Google the walk and find out more about it. The Toronto artist, Barbara Clunder, last summer staged an exhibit of paper cuts dedicated to Laura Secord, and if anyone's interested, I have a book that she published here with me, and I can show it to you afterwards. These are quite beautiful paper cuts that tell Laura Secord's story, do claim her as a brave and loyal woman, but also in their details show the terrible destruction of the War of 1812, which I think is sometimes often lost in the telling of the story. But I think one of the most notable ways in which a story has been told is in a Heritage Minute, which some of you may have seen either on TV or perhaps some years ago in the movie theaters. And before I describe the minute, I'd just like to remind you how her encounter with the Kahnawake Mohawk was described in the 1920s. This following passage is from Mabel Burns McKinley's Canadian Heroines of Pioneer Days. It was published by Longmans in 1929 and endorsed by the Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire. And McKinley described the scenario thus. Secord found herself suddenly in the midst of a band of Indians. When they saw her, the braves started up and rushed towards her, yelling their ear-splitting war whoops. Many were the tales Laura had heard of the cruelty of the Indians. The settlers knew to what dreadful torture the savages put those who fell into their hands. During the war, the Indians had been even more cruel than before. It was indeed a terrible situation for the footsore and weary woman. But Laura did not lose her presence of mind. She must have courage if she were to deal with the Indians. She looked quickly at the band of yelling savages and saw one whom she thought would be their leader or chief. At once she beckoned to him, got his attention, and by signs indicated that she must see Fitzgibbon without delay. She made him understand that she had an important message for the leader of the British forces. Even the safety of the Indians themselves might depend upon it. And it was fortunate that this band of Indians, McKinley wrote, were allies of Fitzgibbon's, and Laura had been able to explain her errand before the savages had harmed her. They led her at once to Beaver Dams. So that's the encounter in 1929. In the Heritage Minute, Laura Secord is not personified as this beautiful young woman that you see in some of these earlier illustrations. She's attractive, but she's quite credible as a mother of 5 children and a woman of 38 years old. And when she walks through the woods, Indigenous people are noticeably absent as an imagined threat. She hears sounds like wild animals, for example, and glimpses American sentries out of her eye. And rather than stumbling upon them as she reaches the British, she instead is shown scrambling up this very steep bank and fainting. She wakes up, and the first thing she sees is a group of Indigenous men bending over her, wearing facial paint and feathers in their hair. She's not at all afraid. She just opens her eyes, says, "Take me to Fitzgibbon." They help her up, and they go off together, with the voiceover telling us that the Laura Secord and the Kahnawake Mohawk saved Canada. So in this narrative, the Mohawk and the white woman are united. They're, in some ways, I think, now domesticated. And the story of the Canadian nation, as personified in Laura Secord's story, is no longer one of racially charged fears and hostility. Instead, in this telling, it's become one of racial harmony and cooperation, a history that's both inclusive from the perspective of those who wrote the Heritage Minute and multicultural. Thank you.